In this technical demonstration, we're going to implement hyper-scalable paths in a more distributed fashion. This implementation will include a combination of servers, each with an individual role, and allows for more flexible scaling than the one-box method, and is scaled for large enterprise-level environments. Now, this implementation option will include two Unix-based systems, one for Redis and another for PostgreSQL. The remaining systems will focus on Centrify components, which will include a Centrify Hyper-scalable paths management node. This server will be used to create the new installation and deployment for hyper-scalable paths roles, which will include a web node, which manages inbound web requests and web API functionality, the background node, which manages background jobs such as password rotation and domain controller synchronization, the TCP relay, which communicates with the Centrify connector for RDP access and AD and other integrations with the infrastructure. And finally, the log relay node, which centralizes the logs onto a single system for easier diagnostics and reporting. Now, it is customary in an implementation of this type to have multiple web, background, and TCP relay nodes, which would be managed using a layer 4 network load balancer to manage the traffic and keep the environment healthy. Now, for this demonstration, I have already deployed and configured both the Redis server and Postgres server, and will focus on the configuration and deployment of the Centrify specific roles. Now, before we get started, it is important to remember that there are some hardware and software requirements you should complete before you begin the implementation. In addition to the Unix server recommended system requirements for the database, you should also take note of the Centrify role requirements, which include Windows 2016 servers configured with the recommended system resources to handle the workload in the environment. These servers should also be configured with the .NET 4.8 framework, a web browser, and the host certificate for the management node server. And once again, for this demonstration, I've already configured the Windows servers and pre-installed the .NET framework and web browser. I also have the host certificate and downloaded the Centrify installation files needed for this implementation. So let's jump into the environment and begin the implementation. Now, in this technical demonstration, we're going to install the management node for hyper-scalable paths. As you can see here, I've already downloaded the Centrify Hyper-scalable paths installation from the Centrify website. We're going to be using 20.4. This is build 203. I've already expanded or extracted the zip file, and as you can see here, we've got some documentation. We have a zip file that's going to be the default installation, as well as my host certificate that I created earlier, and a PowerShell script. Now, the majority of the implementation for hyper-scalable paths is going to be done through PowerShell. So I'm going to go ahead and launch PowerShell. Now, from here, I'm just going to change directories into the hyper-scalable paths installation that I extracted earlier. And as you can see, we have the same contents. Now, to install the management node, all we need to do is run the install.ps1 file. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now, this is going to extract that default zip file that we downloaded from the website. And once we've completed the management node, we can then create our installations, our deployments, and then transfer those deployments over to the individual servers that are going to take on those individual roles, such as a web node, a background node, or the relays. Now, this process will take just a couple of minutes to extract the file and create the management node. And for training and time considerations, we're going to time-lapse some of these installations. And now, as you can see, it has created a new folder, extracted all the necessary pieces that we need for the management node. So let's go ahead and take a look at that folder. Now, by default, it will be Centrify. The destination folder for the management node can be changed through a command line parameter, but for this demonstration, we went ahead and left it as the default. Now we do a directory listing. You'll notice we have a number of subfolders and an entire list of PowerShell scripts that we're going to be able to run. Now, this completes the installation of the management node, and the next step will be to create that new installation. Now, in this technical demonstration, we're going to move from the management node into the individual tasks that the management node is going to facilitate, starting with the new installation. Now this PowerShell script has a number of command line options that you should be aware of. So if you're not sure what those command line parameters are, you can always use the Get Help feature. Let's go ahead and do that now. And as you can see, we have a host of command line parameters to work from. Now we're going to run through a number of these command line parameters during this new installation creation. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll start with the actual script. And the first command line parameter we're going to use is the host name. Now this is going to be the host name, or more importantly, the vault URL that you're going to use. Now in this more enterprise level implementation, this is probably going to be a URL that you're going to have on your load balancer that will point to one or more web nodes as part of the implementation. For this demonstration, however, we're only going to use one web node, so I'm going to use the fully qualified domain name of that web node server, which in this case is going to be hspos-web.hspos.net. Next, we'll need our certificate information. So we'll go ahead and add in the path to the certificate. And since this particular certificate does have a password associated to it, we'll go ahead and add in our password. Next, we'll need to supply the database information and the Redis server information. So let's go ahead and do that. This will start with DB user, which in this case will be Postgres, the DB password, and finally the DB server, which again can be the IP address or the DNS name of that particular server. So we're going to go ahead and use the DNS name. Which is psql.hspos.net. Next, we'll need the Redis server information. Once again, you can use the IP address or the DNS name. And finally, we're going to need the administrator information. Now, this is going to be the initial administrator that we're going to have for the identity platform. This is going to be a Centrify directory account and not an Active Directory account. So let's go ahead and add that in now. The administrator name, we'll just call it admin. The administrator password, and finally the administrator email. Now there are two additional command line parameters that you're going to want to use during your production implementation. That is going to be the company name and the license key. This is supplied by Centrify and is going to be specific as it has been in previous OP or on-prem installation methods. Now for demonstration purposes, I'm not going to use these two options. We're simply going to go through and create the new installation. And now as you can see, it's going through the process of creating the new installation with the configuration that I've provided. Once again, this might take a couple of minutes. But as you can see here, we have a tenant ID as well as an admin username. And now our installation is complete, and we have an indicator letting us know that the next step is to create that new deployment that will be based off of this installation. Now in this portion of the demonstration, we're going to create a new deployment that is going to be used for the deployment of web nodes, background nodes, TCP relays, and log relays. this is going to be one standard installation package that can then be transferred to those individual servers that are going to facilitate those roles. So let's go ahead and run through the new deployment PowerShell script. And this PowerShell script does have additional command line parameters. For this demonstration, we're only going to use 2 of them. So we'll start with the host name once again. And again, this is going to be either the vault URL that you'll apply to your load balancer or the fully qualified domain name if you're only using one web node. Next, we'll need to supply the ID. Now, the ID command line parameter is optional. You do not have to use it. For this demonstration, we are going to provide a unique ID that we can easily identify. If you choose not to supply the ID command line parameter, an ID will be generated. So we're just going to go ahead and use a simple ID name that we can easily identify. I'm just going to call this one Omicron HQ, and we'll go ahead and press enter. And now, as you can see, an archive with the configuration that we specified in the new installation is now going to be created, and this zip file is what we're going to use to deploy all of our individual nodes. And now, as you can see, the new deployment has been created and is being stored in a subdirectory called installations. So let's go ahead and take a look at that installation. As you can see here, we do have only one new installation. Within that new installation, we have a configuration subfolder as well as a deployment subfolder. Under deployments, you'll see that we have our new deployment that does have a date stamp associated to it. And within that subfolder, we have our customized Omicron HQ deployment zip file. Now, once again, this zip file will then be transferred over to the individual servers that are going to facilitate the web, background, TCP relay, and log relay nodes. Now, in this portion of the technical demonstration, I've switched over to the server that's going to act in the role of a web node. I have opened up a Windows Explorer window, and I have remotely connected over to the management node where I have found the customized deployment. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create this web node. I'm going to start by copying this particular zip file, and we're just going to drop it into a folder called Centrify. Now from here, I can go ahead and extract it as I would with any other zip file in this folder. We're actually going to do this from PowerShell. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of Windows Explorer. Now from here, we're simply going to expand the archive. So we'll type in expand-archive Omicron HQ.zip. And now, as you can see, we now have a subfolder that's been created for Omicron HQ. Now you can see we have 2 subfolders, a new PowerShell script, and a customized Centrify platform zip file. This is what's going to create our identity platform. So now we're going to go ahead and deploy the web node. Now before we do that, let's take a look at the Centrify-pos-deploy PowerShell scripts, because there are some command line parameters that we should be aware of. So from here, we'll go ahead and do our directory listing once again. And let's go ahead and type in get help Centrify-pos-deploy.ps1. And as you can see here, we do have a number of command line parameters. Not as many as the new installation, but these command line parameters are very specific. is you remember from a previous video when we did the one box implementation, we did use the one box command line parameter. Since we're doing this in a more distributed fashion, we do need to use the command line parameters for each individual node that we're deploying. So since we're deploying the web node, we're going to use the web node command line parameter for this portion of the demonstration. So let's go ahead and do that. Centrify -pos -deploy -web node, and we're going to give this an ID as well as we did for the new deployment. And since we are deploying a web node, we're just simply going to call this one web node 1. We'll go ahead and press enter. And now as you can see, it's writing the deployment log, it's extracting the archive file. Now this will take a couple of minutes as it goes through the process of installing the identity platform. And now as you can see, the web node has been deployed, but there's a couple of things you should also pay attention to. First, that the current deployment for Omicron HQ is not currently active. Now, in the previous video where we implemented the one box method, the one box command line parameter automatically set this to active because it deployed all of the necessary nodes to the single system. In this particular instance, we will actually have to use a PowerShell script to set it to active, which you'll learn later in this technical demonstration. So at this point, we've satisfied the web node, and the next step will be to deploy the background node. Now, in this portion of the demonstration, I've switched from the web node over to the background node. As you can see here, I have remotely connected to the management node to identify the deployment that we're going to use to deploy the background node to the server. So as we did for the web node, we're simply going to copy that same customized deployment zip file. I'm just going to drop it into my Centrify folder. And we'll go ahead and close the Windows Explorer because we'll do everything from PowerShell at this point. So let's go ahead and move over to the Centrify folder. And we'll go ahead and expand the archive once again. Let's go ahead and change directories into that folder now. And once again, we have the same information that we saw in the web node. Now let's go ahead and deploy the background node. So this will be Centrify -pos -deploy. Now instead of using the command line parameter for the web node, we're going to use the one for the background node. So this will be background node. And again, we'll give it an ID so we can identify it. In this case, we're just simply going to call it BCK node 1. And as it was for the web node, it'll go through the process of extracting the customized zip file so that it can copy the necessary files, install them with the appropriate services to complete the background node. And now as you can see, the background node has been deployed. So now we can move on to the final two steps, which will be the deployment of the TCP relay as well as the log relay. Now for this portion of the demonstration, we're going to go through the process of installing or deploying that TCP relay node. Now as you can see here, once again I have remotely connected to my management node. To find the deployment, we're going to copy it and drop it into our Centrify folder. And now that that's completed, we'll go ahead and exit Windows Explorer and we'll go into PowerShell. So from here, let's go ahead and expand the archive once again. We'll go into the folder And now we're ready to deploy the TCP relay. Now, it's important to remember that with the web node, background node, TCP relay, and even the log relay, you're going to use the same steps if you have to scale and deploy additional nodes. The important aspect here to remember is that layer 4 load balancer. So if you're going to deploy multiple nodes in your enterprise production environment, that load balancer becomes very, very important so it can balance the traffic properly and keep the solution healthy. So let's go ahead and continue on by deploying the TCP relay. Centrify-pause-deploy. This will be relay node, and the ID will be TCP relay 1. And as you can see, the TCP relay has now been deployed. So let's move over to the log relay next before we complete the deployment. Now in this short technical demonstration, we're going to deploy that logging relay. This is going to be very similar to what we've done in previous node deployments with hyper-scalable paths. I've already browsed over to my management server where my deployment is located. We're going to go ahead and make sure that we drop that into our Centrify folder. We'll move over to PowerShell. We'll move into our Centrify folder, and we'll expand the archive once again. Now that that's done, let's go into the Omicron folder, and let's go ahead and deploy the logging relay. Now the command line parameter for the logging relay is going to be logging. We'll give it an ID once again. This one will be log1. And now as you can see, the log relay has now been installed. Now, as we've gone through each of these steps, it's important to remember that we still do not have an active deployment. So what we're going to do next is we're going to move back over to the management node to take care of some small housekeeping procedures. Now at this point in the deployment, we've deployed our management node, a web node, a background node, a TCP relay, and a log relay. But as mentioned before, we do need to set this to an active deployment. Now before we do that, there's a couple of other PowerShell scripts that I'm going to go over with you so that you can get a good idea as to where you stand as it relates to maintaining hyper-scalable paths. Now we're not going to go through all of these, but there's just a couple of them that we want to take a look at. The first is to get the deployment. Let's see if we actually do have an active deployment. So in order to do that, we're going to use the get deployment PowerShell script. So Centrify-paths-get deployment. Now I don't have to add a command line parameter. I will be prompted if necessary. And as you can see here, there are no current active deployments found. Even though we've deployed all of these nodes, we don't have one at this point. But let's take a look at a node list to see what is out there. So that is Centrify-paths-node list. As you can see here, it does display all of the nodes that we have deployed, but you'll also notice that they aren't currently inactive. So let's go ahead and set the active deployment. So Centrify-paths-set active deployment. And as you can see, we are prompted for a host name. And remember that our host name is going to be our vault URL. Now the vault URL is most likely going to be applied at your layer 4 load balancer, especially in cases where you have multiple web nodes and background nodes deployed. Now in this particular demonstration, we use the fully qualified domain name of the only web node that we deployed. So that's what we're going to do here. So hspause-web web.hspos.net. Now it's going to prompt us for the deployment ID. So this is based on the new deployment that we created very early on in this deployment process. So this is simply going to be Omicron HQ. And as you can see, we've returned to our prompt without error. Let's go ahead and rerun those other two PowerShell scripts, starting with the get deployment. And now as you can see, it does return the active deployment. Let's now take a look at our node list. And now as you can see, our node list indicates that we have our web node online and active. And the same is true with our background role or background node. And now we should be able to launch our browser and proceed over to our fully qualified domain name or our vault URL. In this case, hspos-web.hspos.net. And now as you can see, we're prompted for a login. Let's go ahead and use that login that we created at the time we created the new installation, which was admin, and our password. And now as you can see, we've received our welcome screen. We are into the identity platform, and we are up and running. Now this completes this demonstration on installing hyper-scalable PaaS in a distributed or enterprise level implementation.